as a performer, it is very important for us to know what Wagner is doing the leitmotifs and why he needs the leitmotifs. I do not think that Wagner is composing in the leitmotif system, let's call it, in order for us to recognize symbols and to only attach a symbol to a motif when we hear them together in the score. I think that the reason Wagner invented the leitmotif is because he wanted to free, as you probably know from his books, he wanted to free opera from the structural form which prevailed in classical music up until his time. Wagner is responsible for very many revolutions in composition in the 19th century. And in the history of music, there is, again, I don't have to tell you, anybody who rivaled him in the amount of inventions and revolutions. But one very big and very important invention, and I would say complete negation of anything that was prevailing before that time, is the freedom of formal structure. Because Wagner believed that a formal structure cannot be put upon a poem and fit to it somehow. Because you are squeezing and turning and making the story fit the form, because the form dictates the sequence of events in the opera. And he believed that the only form has to come from the poetry, from the text, from the story, and this has to dictate how the structure is being built in the opera, and not vice versa. You cannot take a sonata form, which is what Mozart does in the operas, and Beethoven in Fidelio, and Italian opera, etc. You cannot take a sonata form and say this will fit the story of the first scene in the second act of Walküre between Wotan and Fricka, because this is a conversation, and how can we put this conversation into the sonata form? So he had to come up with something else that would work, because what is a form? A form, in very simplistic words, a sonata form is one theme, a main theme, a secondary theme, then a development, and then the repetition of the themes at the end. It's working with themes. But Wagner thinks if we have enough material that comes from poetical ideas, and I will work with those materials, this will give me the form. This is the musical structure. But what he does with it is not only present it whenever we have the tree or the sword in the first act of Walküre, we hear the sword motif. He uses it in fantastic ways to work with us, the audience, as listeners, and to give a psychological sub-context to the scene at hand. I would like just to show you 4 or 5, for me, phenomenal examples of what Wagner is doing. So let's start with a very simple one. I'm sure you know all the Hunding motif from the first act of Walküre. Bum, bum, ba 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 bum, ba bum. Yeah? So whenever Hunding moves in the first act, we hear that. It's a little bit overkill, it's true. It appears very many times. But when we're in the second act, in this scene between Wotan and Fricka, as you know, Wotan is coming after this little encounter with a jubilant Brunhilde, and she's going off, and he's staying there, and Fricka is coming in and is saying, I need to talk to you about something very serious. Relax, sit down, and he says to her, Was Fricka kümmert, künde sie frei. What interests Fricka, let her speak freely. And then the orchestra plays. Just once, before she starts singing, and then she sings, Ich vernahm Hundings Not. She talks about Hunding. So this is a very simple example. We in the audience are getting the information, what she wants to talk about before she opens her mouth. Just by hearing Hunding motif. Now, since we heard it 55 times in the first act, we know to associate the motif with Hunding, and he gives us information. Then we have another little example of the same use in the same recitative style scene between the two of them. This is when Fricka says, Wann hast du erlebt, dass leiblich Geschwister dich lieben? When did you hear that flesh and blood, brother and sister, fall in love with each other? The orchestra goes. Oh. Today, you have witnessed this for the first time. But the orchestra is playing Winterstürme, yeah? So the height of the love scene between the two. And so on and so forth. So this is a second example of the simple use of motive to let us know, us the audience, let us know what is happening and relate to what was happening in the first act. So we have the story done. A much more wonderful example and more interesting is Brunhilde comes back. So we hear Brunhilde singing from outside the Walküre motive. And she sings it twice, ho, 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 and then she comes in. And when she comes in, I'm sure you know, she sees Wotan and Fricka, and by seeing Wotan's face, she knows that something went very, very wrong. And how does she react to that? The motive which she sang before, hoyot ho, we hear it loud, in tempo. It gets a wrong note at the end, and it slows down, which means, aha. Without even seeing a performance on stage, we can see her face fall and understand that something went terribly wrong. And then Fricka sings her what I call Schumann lied. It sounds exactly like a Schumann lied. Now, Wagner always developed. The next opera was always more interesting and more advanced than before. And the two examples I want to show you from Parsifal are even more fascinating. The first would be the Parsifal motive. Whenever Parsifal comes in, we have this motive. And I'm playing it now from the beginning of the second scene of the second act when he's coming towards the Blumenmädchen, the girls. We hear the first time it's in a wrong key, C flat major, never mind, it's because he's coming from far away. Then we're getting closer to his real key, because in the first act it's B flat major, now we're in E flat major, and it gets louder. So we know that Parsifal is coming. When in the third act, Parsifal is coming back with a sword, there's a very slow introduction in the orchestra. And then we have one prolonged note, and you know the scene. He's coming near the Quell, near the well, and Gurnemann spots him, and he says, "Who is this? It's not one of the knights. I don't know this guy." I mean, he's dressed in a shield and spear, in armor, and he's holding a sword. And the orchestra plays the following. So there's a very long note, then the timpani makes the suspension. Which is, if we play it fast, it's the same motive but in minor, but it's now very slow. And it goes not where it always went before. So again, we heard it 30 times before, and now, what is Wagner doing? It's very simple. He's telling us, the audience, who this guy is. So Gurnemann does not know. But we hear, if we know that this is the Parsifal motif, but he's coming and he's tired because he was lost for a long time, of course, it's in minor and it's very, very slow. This is another way of using a motive, and for me, a very, very beautiful example is in Parsifal. This is the bells. And this motif we hear throughout the transition music to the grail scene in the first act, and then the bells, of course, and it stays, it really is the theme that is used throughout the grail scene by the bells and by the knights, etc. This is a very diatonic, non-chromatic motif. A falling fourth, and another falling fourth. This is not harmonized when the bells are playing it. It is harmonized, of course, when the orchestra is playing it. But then, in the last act, after Gurnemanz recognizes Parsifal, and he's telling him the bad situation with the knights, and he says the grail is not being shown anymore, and we have no food, and again, you know the story, and the orchestra starts playing this. Do you see the connection? This was the bell motif. All of these figurations are following the same structure, but they are skewed. They never come to the original falling fourth and another falling fourth. It represents the decay of the old good times when they were having the sessions where they were showing the grail. But it doesn't exist anymore, so it's tritones. Instead of a perfect fourth, which is a diatonic, tritone always represents some kind of pain, sorrow, something that went awfully wrong. But then Wagner continues, we only hear something that is close in the structure to the original motive, but never the correct notes. Then we have an incredible development in the orchestra, just when Kundry is washing his feet. After that, clarinet playing. Then we have the woodwinds. This sounds like a search. And then the cello and the basses play very softly. I think if you sit in the audience, you can hardly tell that this is the motive. But what's happening here is that just by using the one motive, telling Parsifal what was happening since he left, how they were eating root, like the animal in the forest, Tiere im Wald, but then after he came back, he brought the spear, and they're making king out of him, and now he sees the chance of the grail being shown again, and that everything will be okay, and we hear for the first time the motive coming back in the basses, and then it develops, and then of course we hear it till the end of the opera in its perfect positive form. So these are just a few examples of how I see that Wagner is working with the motives and why he needs them and why they gel together so many aspects of the long-winded story, because he gives us so much information just by using the motives, and he's free of structure, because just moving from one motive to the other, he can create the puzzle of a complete scene.